What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the 3D Muscle Journey podcast. My name is Eric Helms. I am the Chief Science Officer of 3DMJ, and I'm here with coaches Brian Miner and the Godfather himself, Jeff Alberts. Today, we're going to be talking about the intersection between focus, intent, effort, the mind-muscle connection, and biomechanics, and how we can use both experience and science to find the right blend of decisions to make good exercise selection and adjustment that you can use either with your athletes if you're a coach or for yourself if you're just trying to get as humanly jacked as possible while still loving the process. So I think first things first, since Jeff just hit that badass double biceps, what are your main foci, the things that you like your athletes to focus on in terms of the actual execution of exercises? Because I know a lot of online coaches, they kind of just focus on the X's and O's of the program. They focus on the X's and O's of the macros, those three numbers, and they often don't do much with, say, exercise execution or technique. There are plenty of coaches who do that, but I know something that we have seen over the years is when you make assumptions about even relatively high-level bodybuilders' execution, technique, ability to gauge proximity to failure, and even ability to target the intended muscle with certain exercises, it's not always as good as you'd anticipate based upon how many years they've been in the gym or even sometimes their physique. So, Jeff, talk to me about how that's even a variable that you coach and what are kind of the key performance indicators that you focus on.
I think it's should be focused on probably first before any of all that, because you could have the perfect program on paper, but if your form, technique, your ability to hit proximity to failure isn't there, then it's almost moot. So it's like you have to be able to perform at a high level and standardize how you're executing. I think that's super important because sometimes we could maybe get in the weeds a little too much as far as like how flawless you look going from A to B. I kind of think of it as long as you're being safe and your first rep looks like the last rep, maybe just slower. That's what we're kind of looking for. So the way I kind of coach that is, of course, video is going to tell all, and not just looking at a video, because I can look at a video. Let's say I'm watching Brian lift, and like visually it looks good, but maybe while he's executing, it doesn't feel good. So it's important that not just like having someone send you a video of them exercising, but have them talk through it. What are they actually experiencing? Is there any discomfort, aches, or pains? Does it just feel uncomfortable doing a certain movement in a particular way? Doesn't mean you have to change an entire exercise out. It might just be little nuances like, okay, I just need you to move your hand in 1 inch. Or like sometimes on a pressing movement, just where I kind of place the bar in my palm, like just sliding it down a 1/4 inch, because all of a sudden just changes things for me and it feels so much better. You're able to generate a little bit more force. So those little nuances, I think, because there's like the science side, as you know, Eric. There's also the skill component of lifting, but there's also the art side of lifting. And I think this is where the artsy stuff, like these little nuances, don't get talked about enough. And it is challenging to talk about this type of stuff online and let's say an Instagram post or something like that. So having long form content like this, like you can really get into the weeds with that. And it could be super beneficial for people.
Yeah, having started in this game as a one-on-one personal trainer, and before that, just being a lifter, right? And having done some in-person stuff over the years, each time I get the opportunity to do like a workshop or be there with a client or people attending a workshop and show them stuff, I'm like, oh wow, we really are limited, even when we're presenting content because there are so many things. I almost like you described it as like the skill and the art. I feel like the science provides principles, but then how you actually move towards those or execute them really has to do with the kinesthetic learning process, like the actual motor pattern of playing your sport a certain way. And it's funny, we're much more willing to forgive the way athletes move in performance sports than we are in bodybuilding. Like we'll accept the style of a Larry Bird, showing my age here, um, you know, and we'll accept the style of certain types of runners. It's a little more contentious in track and field, but at a certain point, like, okay, Michael Johnson's, even though he's standing too upright and he's not getting the kind of arm or leg movement, he's got a few gold medals. We're going to let him get away with it, that type of thing.
Yeah. As
So,
an example I give, like when I talk about like Steph Curry, his
mhm,
free throw, he's like 91% career, which is pretty good, like real good. And then Rick Barry, and now I'm showing my age here, Eric. So Rick Barry of the 70s, 80s, he shot granny style, yeah, which is very unorthodox. But he shot at like 89, 90% career clip. So it's really not that much difference there, but their styles are totally different, but they're getting results. So it's like, how can you look at Rick Barry and say, hey, you're doing it wrong?
yeah. Yeah. And I think the one thing we do have to be sure of is that we don't, like, just because someone is performing an exercise a certain way is not them stating, this is the way everyone should perform it, or I believe this is optimal. Like as you always say, Jeff, there's some context as to why they are doing that. And I think a lot of people online, either out of their own insecurity, because they're not sure what they should be doing, um, or just as a desire to feel smart or look intelligent, or because it's really quick and easy to not think and post things, they treat it like that. Um, so it can be frustrating online, but I do think it's not a perfect comparison, and we're not saying that just because someone's jacked, whatever they do is justified. Because there's plenty of people who lift in a certain way. I'd be like, you probably don't want to emulate them. That person
True.
is probably jacked despite what they do, and they look pretty injury resilient to me. But I do think people need to understand that there's a lot of lenience with the way we do things in bodybuilding for the purpose of hypertrophy. And I would say there's actually more lenience than for many performance outcomes. Um, like one thing we talked about when we were chatting last time was tempo. And I think ultimately you can lift slow, you can lift fast. It might change the load, it might change the objective volume that you get on that exercise. But ultimately, the data is pretty clear that if, for example, you get to a point where you're unintentionally slowing down on the concentric, even if you were intentionally slowing down on the concentric earlier, that's not the best thing for power production or strength development. We got data that's clear on that. But you're going to grow muscle the same way, even if you're using lighter loads. There's a reason to do it. Maybe you want to lighten load on a given joint, or you don't feel like you can retain the same type of intent and form and focus on the same muscle when you go heavier and move quicker. But those things it's good to have that flexibility. And I think there's a lot of content right now that is unnecessarily restrictive in terms of how to perform exercises and how to program. Like all exercises should be done in a 5 to 8 rep range at a 1 to 2 RIR, and that's it. And then only these certain exercises that produce a bias challenge in the lengthened position while providing adequate stability are worthwhile. And I think high levels of effort, consistency, and doing an appropriate dose, it makes those differences between exercises and some of these choices so small as to not matter. And we're losing far more than we're gaining by being so focused on the minutia. And I think it's like saying, hey, it is true that if I went to the beach right now and I got a glass of water and I took some water out of the ocean, there would be less water in the ocean. And I use this analogy a lot because it is true. Now there's less water in the ocean, but it doesn't matter. And that's sometimes, I think, what we're focusing on when we're talking about the context of someone training well, consistently, and applying a certain level of effort. So, Brian, you're a connoisseur of some of the biomechanics, and you do like to try to optimize things. So do I. Um, how do you put these types of messages into context when you are working with clients? And where do you kind of draw the lines in the sand? Because you do at a certain point want to go, you know what, I really think we should do a different exercise. There are times, for that.
Yeah, I my view on this has evolved more and more, probably just over the past few years even. Um, I think hypertrophy is a very forgiving goal in terms of what you can get away with. Um, I think when it comes to exercise selection, if we're looking at like a bottom up style of programming where it's like, let's assess the person's needs, let's pick an exercise, let's put it, standardize the execution as best we can. And then from there, we can progress off of that. If we can do that and we can get somebody training a movement pattern in a comfortable and sustainable manner, then I think in the long run, we end up in a very similar position when it comes to overall hypertrophy. And especially with like natural athletes, when there's ultimately going to be, maybe not technically a cap in terms of muscle growth, but most people that are in this for the long haul that are listening to this podcast, they're going to come close to their genetic potential anyway. So it's like, are we obsessing over these small details and maybe we get there 6 months sooner? It's like I don't know how it for a lot of the people that I work with, I find they're just using a lot of mental bandwidth or come to us using a lot of mental energy trying to optimize things based off, like you said, something online, sort of the kind of the classic green check mark red X thing that was possible for a while or was popular for a while on Instagram. Like, do it this way, don't do it this way. And I'm glad that sort of fell, by the wayside for the most part. But I think that first and foremost, finding an exercise that's comfortable and doesn't cause discomfort, that is training the overall pattern. So, for example, like a sagittal pull down, a sagittal plane pull down. Like there's an infinite number of options that you can do there, in terms of different machines, unilateral, pulling slightly across the body, maybe getting into a longer position, um, manipulating the resistance profile if you have access to it. But in the end, like it's a sagittal pull. And if you get close enough to failure with a more or less standardized technique, you're going to be achieving the stimulus that you're after. So I think when you can kind of look at what the physiological objective is in terms of like slower contraction velocity, like that involuntary reduction in rep speed, like you said, I think a lot of the differences even out. I don't think there's much of a difference. So where I start, like I said, is finding an exercise that's comfortable for that person. And, just because like a hack squat looks good on paper in terms of biasing quads, if there's somebody who, any large degree of quad bias tends to aggravate their knees, then it's like that's a pretty poor exercise selection for them, and at least at that moment in time. So I'm very lenient. I like to provide a lot of autonomy to people, but give them parameters to work within. I think, it's not just like, okay, do a press, whatever press you want. It's not like that, but let's do an incline, maybe a free weight incline press of some sort, or something that is loading the lengthened position to a reasonable degree. Then you have something like a hammer strength press, that any like of those pendulum style presses where maybe it's heaviest in the shortened position. So I might recommend something like that as in a secondary slot. If we're trying to get a high return on our investment, I might program something more length and biased initially. Um, but yeah, I think there's a lot of flexibility there. And I think even with technique, because there's a difference between ego lifting and reaching failure with a given technique and then sort of breaking form. Because in that case, like this is sort of goes hand in hand with the conversation of technique as a means of progressive overload. If we're compensating and using momentum involuntarily, then usually it's because we can't meet the force demands in that position any longer. And in that case, continuing the set, it's essentially like a drop set on like the fire, like you're reallocating, you're reducing the demands in that position. So that I think there's some leniency there too, if somebody can do that safely. So it's not like every set, like, yeah, you want to build on that foundation of consistent technique where like their zero RIR is where, the last rep they can complete before there's some compensation. But if they go beyond that, it's not automatically like this, pursuit of, ego lifting or, necessarily increasing their risk of injury. I mean, it can be, but I think there's just much more leniency in a lot of this than what the narrative on social media tends to be of late.
I totally agree. Yeah. I think, and it can be very difficult to distinguish the difference when you're just watching without necessarily understanding why and what someone's doing. Like just yesterday, I posted a video of my third plus one set on bench press. Um, for one, bench press wasn't even planned that day, but the machine chest press that I normally do in that slot was there. And probably someone's like, "Why did you do triceps earlier in the session?" Again, the thing that I was planning to do, someone was on it, and we had to shuffle things around. And again, like the data actually, like on paper, it makes more sense to do bench before triceps because triceps will make your triceps fatigued, and then you won't be able to give as much in other places. But it kind of all comes out in the wash if the intent and the effort is there. So yeah, I had initially planned to do something that was more challenging and actually got a deeper stretch with that nice chest press machine. Wasn't available. So something I decided to do because I really wanted to push my pecs pretty much to the limit of what they could do in that session. And it's fine if my triceps aren't going to contribute as much because pecs got to come to the party. Was on my last set, I did, 100 kilos, 100 kilos. Then I went from a 90 to a drop into 60. And on bench press, I like drop sets because I can get light enough to where I'm not worried if I get it stuck with the bar on my chest and I have a workout partner. So I went past failure and did partials on bench press with 60 kilos or like roughly 135 pounds after doing, 200 pounds. And I was just trying to think like, how would Eric from 10 years ago view that? Like this guy's randomly doing a different exercise, changing the order. He's not doing bench before triceps. And
How are you
now he's
gonna follow
doing
your
these.
progressions, bro?
Yeah, how do you even track that? And then like he's
Yeah,
just doing these
100%.
partials at the end. Like this guy's just going for the burn and pump. Doesn't he know that progressive overload is important? Um, Yet I know exactly how to track that. I do it consistently. And I have that's something that I could see like, oh, well, I counted all my reps and I put it as a failure set in my tracking app. And even if they were partials, and that's the way I did it last time, So I think that's a hard thing to communicate, if someone is not there with you or training with you on a regular basis. And I've become much more forgiving and maybe less of an ass as I've gotten older with how I view other people training. Because I just understand how many times I make calls in the moment, make adjustments like that, make decisions, and I'm still going towards the same outcome and goal. Like it fits the same set of objectives that I have in my head that I haven't necessarily communicated to an onlooker, but they might just be thinking I'm some meathead, and I am, but I'm also a meathead with intention. So
My
Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say I was gonna talk about my hotel workout at when I went on vacation to San Diego. So they had 50-pound dumbbells, and trying to do chest press with that. I mean, I'm like, if I want to go to failure, I'm gonna be pushing probably like 20 and above. And my gauge on that is I don't even know if it's good or not because I never go above 20 reps. So it's like, okay, and I know it's not gonna be practical because I'm not used to it. So I'm like, okay, how am I going to get an effective stimulus? So I did one set and I was like, oh, this is too light. I did like 15 reps. It's too light. So like, how can I get a stimulus here? I'm like, well, I mean, some guys do 21s for biceps. I'm like, well, why can't I know I can't do 777 on the chest press with 50s, but I can maybe do threes. So I did 3 at the bottom in the stretch position, 3 reps. Then I took it to the top and I did 3 at the top. And then I did 3 full range of motion. And I did that until I failed out. I don't know how many exact threes I got within that set, but I just took it till I failed. And like, okay, I know I got to failure, so I know I got a stimulus. I'm sure I recruited all muscle fiber types here. So I took confidence in that. So it's just, in a sense, like taking confidence in knowing training principles. And I don't have to worry about tracking it because it's a one-off. I'm at a hotel gym. And once I get back at home, I'm going to be back into my normal routine. But whenever I'm thinking of my own training, whether it's at home or I'm on the go or something, like how can I get a practical, effective, and safe stimulus? That's how I think about it. And like Brian was saying, it's like it's very forgiving. Like there's so many different ways to accomplish that. And as far as exercise order, like you're talking about, Eric, like if let's say you standardize, I'm going to do tricep press down before bench press every session. That's the baseline. And
Yep,
if you're worried
totally
about
fine.
progressions, it's a new baseline. You're working off of that. So I'm going to try to increase a rep, increase a load where I can. But it's whenever you change a baseline, people kind of freak out a little bit. But if you think from that perspective, it just makes things a lot more comfortable and confident as you move forward. My
Absolutely.
question for you guys is exercise selection, like the importance of that when it comes to like trying to optimize hypertrophy. And not just exercise selection, but nuancing in a way like, like the hot topic was like hitting certain angles like for back training and things like that. Like, looking at a traditional like pull down versus like something like cross body or something like that. Like how do you guys view that? Like, do you feel like that's, I don't know, like Brian is saying, sometimes you're just like you're getting into the weeds a little bit trying to optimize these things and how much of a real difference is this making, in the short term and in the long term?
I don't know if we can say with certainty, I don't know if there's enough on the back stuff in particular.
It could be
And
it could
Eric,
be back stuff, it could be
yeah.
chest stuff, like, what I mean, or like, for example, a hack squat or a leg press, like, you got your feet are way down on the platform, narrow foot stance, trying to bias the quads a little more so than versus a traditional stance, like, how much of this stuff is it making a difference in the short term and then in the long term as well?
I think if the joint is going through a similar range of motion and it's getting loaded in a similar manner, I don't think there's much difference that's discernible in the short term. Um, so what I would tell an athlete I'm working with is like go with what's available or what you enjoy, because I think that's a variable that's just overlooked, I feel like, entirely with a lot of this conversation is if someone enjoys doing something, like even if it's slightly suboptimal on paper, or they think, or they have the impression or have been told that it's suboptimal, if you enjoy something, you're going to get probably a higher degree of output, motor unit recruitment, for something that you're psyched up to do rather than like, oh, I've been told, I need to hack squat or I'm, you know, the dogma of, back squatting. You got to have a bar on your back or pull from the floor. And it's like, if somebody just hates doing that, it becomes a very poor exercise, regardless of what it is biomechanically. So I, I don't know how much, as long as it's a similar loading pattern across a similar range of motion, I haven't heard like a compelling argument that there's much difference there. But
Is there
Eric,
any
you might have
studies on
some.
that, Eric? As far as like on a leg press, for example, like a standard stance versus like, I'll slide this all the way down, get my feet really close together and get more range of motion maybe and get is there any differences there? Any studies?
Yeah, there are. And I think I'm going to be like, this is one of those things where the
And if
practical
there are, wait,
things,
wait, 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 wait. And if there is differences and they're significant, is it worth going down that hole if, let's say, like Brian said, that maybe it's not as enjoyable? Like, how do you make that decision to, I'm going to chase this optimality versus like, now I'm going to go with like what Jeff and Brian say, I'm going to pick these exercises based on comfort and enjoyability because I'm going to get more out of it long term.
yeah, I think ultimately I have a set of principles that you follow for exercise selection for hypertrophy that are a blend of those practical factors and what is very pretty firm in the science as principles that I think are quite empowering if you understand them. And some of them are super intuitive, and some are things where you go, oh, yeah, I guess I was focused too much on the nuance. I think one thing I will say is for people who are trying to get everything out of themselves and optimize things, um, the message sometimes of, yeah, just, do what fits best and does well. And like, yeah, like some people are like, yeah, I get that. I'm a professional bodybuilder who enjoys trying to be competitive and I'm trying to improve. So thanks, guys. But if I could make things better and I understand the context, how would I do that? And I think it's good that we kind of laid the groundwork first of like, hey, let's put this in context. And from a scientific perspective, on what you were just asking about, when there's significant differences, um, really what we need to know is, are there meaningful differences for whom, over what time course, and how confident are we in them? And how much of a difference is it going to make? And I will push back a little bit against Brian, your take on, everyone's eventually going to get to their genetic muscular potential. I would say 90% of our audience will not ever. So I kind of strongly disagree with that because I think most people don't get there to reach their peak because there are typically logistical constraints or motivational constraints. And when I say motivational, I don't mean like I need motivation right now. I know we always talk on like, discipline and commitment, but when I think of motivation, I think of from like the true meaning of the word, like what's the motive? And do you have a strong why to carry you through? So really, I mean the commitment and the purpose. Because I think most people get to a point in their career, either typically before they've maximized their physique and they go like, I don't have the same drive. Why do I need to get my arms zero point 0.1 inch larger, and for all the work that I have to put in? I had a post that I made a little while ago and someone commented on there and said, I don't need to break an advanced plateau. I'm totally fine with being a lifelong intermediate. The world would be an amazing place if everyone was a lifelong intermediate. And I'm like, you're right. Like that's most lifters. And what you have to do to completely peak out your physique, it requires this being a extremely consistent, regular part of your life, accepting that you're going to get injured, having a strong why, and being in the game and depositing as many pennies as Jeff has, one way or another. And I think most people don't do that. So because of that, and again, just a reminder to all of us, this is 3D Muscle Journey. We talk about competitive bodybuilding so much. Only 30% of our audience are actually competitors. So then we have to think about how many of the actual competitors out there before they retire, get hurt, decide it's not for them or something, actually get to their peak potential. And that's where I kind of get that estimated number from. So in a perfect world, I do think most people will get to that point if they can consistently keep training with a sufficient amount of effort. And I think everything is sort of the dose in disguise. But if you can make your dose more efficient, if you can get more per rep or per exercise or per time spent in the gym, you have a much higher likelihood of getting to where you want to go. And so to then finally answer your specific direct question, Jeff, yeah, we actually do have some research comparing what I would describe as squat patterns. And some of the interesting things we see are that we have generally better data showing that when you train the quads at a longer length, that they do grow better. But how long that length needs to be is still up for debate. The most recent study actually compared like the knees in your chest, bury that low foot position, heels coming up squat to what we would describe as like a typical leg press of like 100 degrees of knee flexion. And in that individual study, there was no significant difference in the quads. But then when we look at multiple other studies on squats, we see that the deeper you squat, potentially the more glute hypertrophy you get. And that might also impact, say, adductor hypertrophy, which is essentially another hip extensor. And then when we look at isolated quad research, we generally see better outcomes in, say, like the vast thigh muscles rather than the rectus femoris from doing like leg press versus leg extension, which has more to do with the biarticular nature of the rectus femoris than just the actual movement itself. But you think, well, why doesn't a leg extension give me better like vastus lateralis hypertrophy? It's still working. And if you look at the actual joint angles and leg extensions, they typically aren't as deep as what you get out of a leg press or a squat. And it's hard to match them when you're doing those different movements. And not all studies use like a goniometer. So I think that's interesting. And the other thing I would say is that in the isometric studies, which are kind of cool, so it's a fixed joint angle, and they don't always have like a super, super deep knee flexion joint angle on like the leg extensions. You generally see greater hypertrophy when you are doing isometric, which is like no movement at the joint at a longer muscle length because of a deeper knee flexion angle than a more shallow knee flexion angle. So a general principle that I would, in like my principles that I give someone is, one, it should target the muscle. And I think that is like almost all bodybuilders understand that, get that, can feel that. They might have some confusion about certain nuances of biomechanics and how that applies. The second one is ideally, it challenges the muscle at a long muscle length. Another one is that when you reach fatigue or close to failure, you're getting that involuntarily slow rep speed. There's actually, due to that main muscle that you're trying to train, or main muscles are also unable to produce force and meet the force demands rather than some other synergist, which in this case would actually be a prime mover if it was not near failure. And then there's the practical stuff, what I really like to layer in. And I actually have an acronym called PLATE, which is something I've developed as I'm writing the last edition of my books. And that is that it is pain-free, loadable, and I always forget it, so I'm going to bring it up in front of me so I don't forget. But yeah, pain-free, loadable, available, time efficient, and enjoyable. So obviously, if there's something that might meet those first criteria, but it causes you pain, or that you have no real way of making it harder over time, and you can't set that baseline like you were talking about, Jeff, the loadability is an issue. Like if someone's like, oh, wow, I saw that study on Nordic hamstring curls and it really did a lot of good growth for the biceps femoris short head, but they can't really tell when they're having to like stop the eccentric on their own. They don't have a partner with them. It hurts their knees because they don't have a good pad. And like, where are they going to put their heels? And they hate it. Then like, just go to failure on a leg curl, right? You'll be fine. Or if like they really want to do this single arm chest supported, like pull down that they saw on a billion different TikTok channels, but in a busy gym, they have to move this incline around to these cable stacks that, there's like 13 teenagers around trying to do cable crossovers on, and it's a huge time suck. And they could have done 3 other exercises. Then that's like a poor choice given the constraints. So I think those elements of feasibility should be layered in as like almost like listen, before you even start to get out in the weeds, make sure these things are in place. So that's kind of how I frame it. Like, don't violate plate. And then if we want to get complex, awesome. And the final thing I'll say is that there's a lot more potential for certain muscle groups and movements to be improved because of the nature of the way the human body is built compared to others. Like when someone is like, I really want to optimize my pressing and my quad development and my glute development, you kind of have to do things wrong to get those, like messed up, because most movements that we traditionally do as bodybuilders are pretty effective. But when someone's talking about like, hey, I seem to have really good quads, but not great hamstrings or glutes, or the other way around, or, I've got great delts and chest and arms and biceps, but my back is not that well developed. That's when I think there's actually a fair amount of tinkering you can do, because there's just so many muscles in the back that overlap and do different things. And it's not necessarily clear within individual or between individuals, between different exercises, what actually is the limiting factor and what is actually being targeted and what's being trained. Because of most of these exercises are challenging in like the shortened position. You don't get a lot of DOMs. You don't have a good mind-muscle connection, which we can talk about next. So I think if someone's like, hey, I want to make sure my pressing is just optimized, it'd be like, hey, okay, go to failure. Like it probably doesn't matter that much, And like if you notice that you have awesome delts and triceps, do some flies. Like it's not that complicated. But other things, I think it's worth like, all right, let's put on the mechanics hat.
Hey 3DMJers, this is Andrea Valdez hopping in to remind you about a completely free video course in the 3DMJ Vault called the Pro Bodybuilder Case Study. It's probably the closest, most detailed look at a full-blown contest prep cycle that you've ever seen or been able to follow in one centralized location. One of our 4 head coaches, Brad Loomis, will guide you through an entire 3-year stretch between competitive bodybuilding seasons with one of his longtime athletes and professional bodybuilders, Phil de Guzman. We are so grateful that Phil let us use him as a subject because he and Brad kept phenomenal records, both in their spreadsheets and visually with his progress photos, so that we could track his physique and body weight throughout the whole process. You'll get to follow his career from when he won his first PNBA Pro card in 2020, through his initial recovery phase, through his first cut to make weight for a powerlifting meet, through his second and more robust off-season gaining phase, through his initial prep positioning diet and preseason holding pattern, and finally through his final contest prep fat loss phase where he won his second WNBF Pro card in 2023. It's really such a unique perspective on not only what a time investment it takes to see the results of natural bodybuilding efforts, but also to see how we coach on a macro scale. In this case study course, which again is totally free, you'll get a sense of why we tell our future competitors they can't simply contact us just a few months before they want to get on stage and expect the best results possible. You'll see how Phil and Brad made their long-term timeline and how the big picture considerations allowed for the improvements they were looking for over a few years' time. This is also one of the big reasons that we've recently changed our coaching options and offerings here at 3D Muscle Journey. We know the value of getting athletes ready early and how it impacts their results down the line. So we created some more entry-level onboarding methods to set more people up for success like Phil's in the future. So this kind of leaves me with two pitches here. First off, like I've already said a bunch, go take the Pro Bodybuilder Case Study course. It's for free at 3dmjvault.com, and you'll get all the videos and be able to download Brad's presentation with all of Phil's plans and photos and everything you need to kind of see how this whole coaching machine works over time. And secondly, if you've ever thought of working with us for any goals in the distant future, we think that you should reconsider that and possibly get on the squad now to see how you and your coach can make the most impact together for the long haul. Now, of course, we offer competition coaching with weekly check-ins during the season and occasionally more touch points leading up to specific show dates. But now we also have some great onboarding options for non-competitors as well. There are some lower frequency bi-weekly check-in options and even some training only or nutrition only coaching selections for those who just need help with specific parts of their athlete journey. You can always find links for coaching details on our main website at 3dmusclejourney.com. And additionally, we've got those coaching details directly linked throughout Brad and Phil's course as well, in case you get inspired to sign up while watching the videos in real time. So go ahead and head on over to 3dmjvault.com and check out the Pro Bodybuilder Case Study today. That's 3dmjvault.com to get instant access. Thanks so much for listening and enjoy the rest of the show.
Before we go to mind muscle connection, just to kind of ask you one question in regards to like what kind of differences are we seeing as far as like one study says, okay, if you're more in a shortened position here versus you're a little longer here, like how much of a percentage are we talking about? Is this earth shattering or is it just like 1% or like what are we talking about here? And then because based on that, then you go, okay, the plate, right? I think Brian and I agree with the plate. It's like 100%. It's just more like that optimality, like, and then it's like if you can get that 1% or 10%, whatever it is, Eric, then it's like if the plate isn't lining up all the time, then you can kind of like say, okay, is it really worth it? Because I'm really not putting the right amount of effort towards it, whether that's physical effort, mental effort, emotional effort, like something's going to be lacking there. So, and I can tell you, like, for me personally, like 38 years deep into it and still going, it's like exercise selection is huge, but also nuancing exercises is huge too. Like there's certain movements I can get more longer than others because of discomfort and things like that. So that's kind of I guess that's the big question I'm asking is like how worth it is as far as chasing that optimality and what is it exactly, if there is an answer.
Let me chime in real quick for you. So yeah, I appreciate the pushback and that's good context. And I probably should have worded that a little bit better because
You're damn
I'm
right,
not saying,
Brian.
I'm not saying that everybody that's listening to this is going to.
I've given Brian patience because I saw it. He was like,
Yeah, just
going through Eric's
This
10
son of a-
minutes. He's like,
Yeah.
I'm going to get him.
I just
No,
want
but
to insult Brian and then just talk for 30 minutes and then interrupt him now.
Yeah,
That's the goal.
I'm just trying to invalidate your entire career here. No, I think not everybody's going to reach their genetic potential. I think I'm speaking more through what Jeff just asked. It's like, are these, if you're doing, let's say, I like the plate acronym too. I think if everyone's doing a plate exercise, whatever we want to call it. Over time, I think they're going to end up in a very similar position than if they would have optimized early on. Like, I don't think Jeff's back would be any more impressive if he did like unilateral length and bias stuff from 20 years old on. Like, I think the differences between these wash out significantly over time. And I think that that's the message I was trying to convey there. Not that everyone will reach an advanced level necessarily. But if everyone's consistent, like the people that are doing this diligently for 20, 30 years, yeah, and chances are if they're doing it for that long consistently, not like a weekend warrior type where it's like, yeah, I've been training for 30 years, usually it's twice a week type of thing. But somebody who's been bodybuilding for 30 years, chances are they're doing things mostly right over time, like getting the big rocks in place. Otherwise, they probably would have quit by now. Then I think they're going to end up in a similar spot.
No, I appreciate that clarification. And to be honest, Brian, I was mostly clarifying for the audience because I knew that's what you meant. And yeah, I think there are times when you will get someone who has been in the game a very long time, but they have a weakness. And sometimes you don't know necessarily how much that thing could improve. Berto's a good example where he like changed the way he trained his calves. And even though his calves are not the most favorable combination of tendon length and muscle belly starting point, whoa, pretty big improvements pretty late in the game. And then I think another example would be his back, right? And I would say I'm experiencing some of those. The funny thing is I've done a lot to try to make my legs, especially my quads, really, really improve. I haven't noticed a lot there, but I have noticed things. And, Brian, you can feel free to push back. You're more objective in looking at my physique as of late. I think my back and some of my upper body and definitely my arms and my glutes and hams have improved. And obviously, it's almost impossible for me to go, is that because I'm doing more volume? Is that because I'm training to failure more often? Or is it because of my exercise selection and my intent? And the answer is probably yes, right?
Could be all of the above. Yeah.
Exactly. So to answer your question, Jeff, of how much does this matter, sometimes very little and sometimes quite a lot. And the challenging thing is that we're not really good at communicating. And I say this we collectively. I actually think I'm kind of good at it because I see how often it's an issue. But the typical science communicator is more of like binary. This was better than that. And then they might maybe say something like, yeah, but it probably doesn't matter in the long run. But they're not telling you, here's probably the percentage difference that you can expect over this time frame given where you're at in your career.
That's what I'm kind of asking. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's a challenging question to answer, but it's not impossible. And for some of the things that we really want to know, like there's actually no study out there that has measured lat hypertrophy because it's so hard to measure. So that's not a thing, right? And the number that are measuring like delt hypertrophy are super small. So if we really wanted to actually conduct a study where we took trained individuals and we said, well, how much do we think length and partials are going to do compared to normal training in this context, you need like 150 people per group, and you probably need 3 months. And there are a few studies like that, and they indicate that overall, it is almost an undetectable difference because not that much happens in 8 weeks. But then you get some of these studies where we realize that some of like the traditional exercises or beliefs that we've had are pretty far off. Like, for example, like seated calf raises versus standing calf raises. Like we often like, like the seated calf raise, you need it for the soleus, standing calf raise for the gastroc. And we see just way better outcomes generally from the standing calf raise in multiple studies. Like, oh, okay, there's something going on here. Or we look at something like the relative growth in a
I knew
seated.
that a long time ago. And everybody bashed me because like you only do standing calf raise. Like I don't need seated calf raises because I feel it in my entire calf.
Yep.
And I trained to failure and it's progressive and I could visually see the adaptations.
Yep. Absolutely. I think
One
I
for
think
Jeff.
probably there you go. Jeff knew it before it was scienced. Yeah. I think another one, and I don't have strong evidence for this, but I really do think like the traditional back training, and maybe this is my own personal bias, like do lat pull downs, do a row, and do deadlifts, and you'll have a huge back if you just keep pushing hard and do bent over barbell rows. Like that was my entire back training career, and I watched, Blood and Guts. I watched Ronnie. I was a power lifter, like the amount of good development I got in my back from those movements, it was basically just at the ends. Like I got good lumbar development and then good upper back development and like not much else. Um, and I never had a good mind muscle connection there. And it wasn't until I really started scratching my head and trying different things that I saw differences. And I think when you are unable to actually really target and emphasize and reach a close proximity to failure in the certain muscles that you want to train, you're just getting kind of like a whole lot of extra indirect stimulus. And I think that was my back for years. Like there were certain regions
Same.
that were reaching failure that
You saw my
were,
back all the way until my
yeah,
late 30s. It was underdeveloped. And
that's
I
true.
did the heavy rows. I did the heavy pull. I did all the same, the traditional do a row, do a pull down, and you're good.
Hmm.
But I wasn't good. And this is where the nuance comes into play because I still do the same movements, except for I do more chest support rowing now because of my lower back issues. But I just learned how to execute better. I removed ego, drop load down. Going from A to B was a lot cleaner, better mind muscle connection that we forgot we were going to next.
Yep. We'll get
So, and then all of a sudden I started seeing improvement in my back. And then also kind of learning like, oh, I can bias this row. I can pull a little higher. I could activate my traps more. I could activate my rear delts more.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, I'm kind of killing all these birds with one stone with this one exercise. Like, okay, let me make sure that I'm biasing the pull down in a way where I can target my lats. And like, okay, there we go. I got overall back development with 2 movements.
Yep.
Not exercises, movement patterns.
Yeah.
Because people get married to exercises, you get married to movement patterns. That's how I kind of see it. Because whether you're doing a bench press, a dumbbell press, a machine press, it's almost the same pattern.
Mm. No, I think that's a really important distinction. And so, yeah, there are times where you look at the research and multiple studies comes out and you're like, wow, that's actually a pretty big difference. Like, for example, seated hamstring curls versus lying hamstring curls. But then you have to put it in context. And Brian, you said this multiple times, like, yeah, if we just compare those two exercises, but bro, you're also doing RDLs and good mornings, like you're getting long muscle length challenges in those positions, So it's really like I think that's why science is valuable. It teaches you relationships and principles, but then you need to be able to integrate it into the real world. And I think that's where a lot of people just aren't able to do that. They narrow their view to a reductionist A versus B comparison, and then they think that that is the same as performing it in the context of a holistic plan over time, and it's just not. Um, and science is not meant to do that. Even applied research, you can be like, yeah, like okay, if I have someone whose hamstrings are underdeveloped and they are doing RDLs, they are doing deadlifts, they are doing good mornings, and they are doing leg curls, but they've never done seated leg curls. Sure, let's replace those seated leg curls. Sorry, and they are doing lying leg curls. Sure, let's replace those lying leg curls with seated leg curls and see if that moves the needle, right, or contributes to the outcome. But it's not like anytime I see someone doing a lying leg curl, they're wrong or dumb or that's a bad idea. So yeah, like when you look at those studies, there's some pretty substantial differences in the hamstrings, and it's been replicated.
So the
Yeah.
goal as a practitioner like myself would be to like, okay, I see these big differences here that could be advantageous to somebody. Now the goal is how can I apply that?
Yes.
Now that's the plate.
Yep. Exactly. What do you have access to? Like when we sit down on a call with a client, what's your current program? What do you have access to? What prior injuries do you have? Where do you have pain? And let's evaluate your physique and see what needs to come up. Like, I'm working with a
100%.
guy right now who has ridiculous calves for no reason. I don't really like. I don't care whether seated or standing or low volume or high volume because he doesn't need any more calves, right?
Doesn't
It's just
matter.
it doesn't matter,
Yeah.
right? So I think those are the types of things that you have to filter your decisions using science through, or it's really just a waste of time. But yeah, sometimes there are some notable differences from some of these exercise selection or technique changes, and I think you need to be a connoisseur of the research, or have someone who does that for you, who can kind of give you that information. because some of this stuff is relatively novel and unexpected. Like, I think one of the least intuitive things is not like I've had people give me pushback because they see me doing like a cable row and they're like, when are you're never getting your peak contraction, like you're not doing it. Like, I'm thinking of, the guys in the 90s hitting like Dorian Yates pose where the arms are straight down at the sides. You could see the lumbar, they're contracting their back from the back, and like, oh man. And you think you hear the champions from the 70s and 80s like, oh, when I do a row, I go into extension, I pull back, and I think of the same way my back feels as I'm setting up before I expand on a lat spread. And I get that real deep contraction. And I do feel my back more in some ways when I get into that peak contracted position on a cable row. But I'm also pretty damn sure that's not actually what's producing much of the growth. So there are times when sensation is really helpful, and there are times when sensation tells you some things but not others. Like, yeah, you're absolutely contracting that muscle, you're challenging it, there's a lot of blood in it, but it's probably not experiencing high degrees of tension in a meaningful way that's going to induce hypertrophy long term. And like, I never got my lats sore from doing cable rows the way I used to do them ever.
So
even though
we're
I
talking about
feel
mind
that
muscle
peak
connection
contraction.
now. Now we're talking about mind muscle connection. Finally, okay,
We got there.
we got there. So it's like mind muscle connection, like for you guys, like because you have the camp that will say, I need to feel everything, but then you can tell like they're limiting the amount of loading that you're using. They're not really progressing loads or reps over time because they're slowing things down way too much in a sense to try to quote unquote feel it. And then you have other people that like, forget the mind muscle connection. You just got to be explosive with everything. So it's like these extremes left and right. Now, as far as me, when I think about mind muscle connection, it's almost like I don't think like, okay, I need to feel my hamstrings working on an RDL or I need to feel my pecs on a press. It's more like I focus on moving the load from A to B in a standard way that's safe, that's comfortable, and I'm able to actually get to the appropriate proximity of failure because I know regardless if I feel it or not, if I'm doing that, the muscle has to be working.
Exactly.
It's like when I'm taking a piss, I'm not thinking about my bladder. I got to feel my bladder working. I know if I empty it and I don't hit the outer rim of the toilet bowl, my wife's going to be super happy about that, right? Target is hit, job complete. I didn't have to think about my bladder at all. So that's what I'm thinking about. Like when my muscle connects, if I'm doing that, I know the muscle's going to work regardless. Because I hear a lot of people, like especially on RDLs, like I got to feel my hamstrings working, and sometimes they'll try to bias their hamstrings to a fault. Because you look at their form, you're just like, man, why are you doing like an extreme deficit RDL, man? Your lower back is probably doing most of the work right now, anyways, or at least part of the time. So what do you guys think about with your mind muscle connection? Like, what's your perspectives around all that?
Yeah, it's not something I necessarily have people seek out necessarily. I don't think it's a bad thing if you have a good mind muscle connection. I think that's the other side that's worth mentioning is some people are saying like, okay, if you don't think it's important, then like, is it any better if I have one? It's like, no, it might be. I mean, if you're connecting well with the muscle, but ultimately, like you said, Jeff, if you're executing the movement properly in the way it's intended, the muscle is going to work whether you have that connection or not. And I think just the we're focused more on the neural drive than the feedback that the nervous system is giving to our brain. I think that's one way I think of it. Like when we feel a mind
like
muscle
that.
connection, we're receiving the message, but we don't really care what we receive. We care about the recruitment that we're placing on the muscle. And I think this is, Eric, you can expand on this some if you want, but I think this is where the concept of like neuromechanical matching can have some utility in helping people understand this. Like there's points where at certain joint angles, you have no choice but to recruit certain muscle groups. Whether or not you end up, if you need to bias that range, like I think at the end of the day, as long as you reach close enough proximity to failure, you're going to use your words, like all hands on deck. But there's like, for example, like the bottom of a squat like your adductors are like one of the prime hip extensors in deep hip flexion. If you don't feel your adductors really working hard, then they still are, and I think rep range here I think this is sort of a way to sort of kill the argument for mind muscle connection in terms of it being like something we need to have, because you're going to have a higher mind muscle connection with higher reps in most cases anyway. There's going to be more metabolites produced. There's going to be more feedback to your brain that, okay, this area is fatigued and working. But like, I don't feel like a 1RM attempt, like everything's working as hard as it can, but it's not like I'm thinking like, wow, I am really connected to my quads. I'm thinking like, I just need to move the weight from point A to point B. And so a good way to get a better mind muscle connection, you could do that pretty much with any movement if you were to do higher reps, maybe slow the tempo down and think about it. But I think sometimes that comes at the expense of output if done to the extreme, like you said, Jeff.
It's really well said. I think I like to ask people some questions when they help them think about this, because you're totally right as to how high reps can be useful in knowing that, oh, I do feel that. Like, so why can't you do two reps with your 1 rep max? Most people would like laugh at that question. Like, well, I'm not strong enough. Well, you are. Like, you did it once. What happened to your muscles that prevents you from doing another rep? You actually can't meet the ATP demands to maintain the energy production, to maintain that force output. It's not like there's some little kind of guys who's like, ooh, I'm inside the muscle. There's not like little people. Like what's going on? And
Can you do that again?
that's it's a little, it's right next to the myonuclei. It's a bunch of little, very, very tiny people who hang out next to Titan in the sarcomere lifting weights.
That's perfect.
And then you have to ask, well, what are their muscles doing? It's like this Russian doll thing. Okay, so get that visual out of your mind. But in reality, what it is you can't meet the energy production demands to maintain max force output for 2 reps, right? It's not like there is my tendon would tear or my muscle would be damaged, or that might happen like if you were somehow able to artificially never have ATP depletion. Phosphocreatine system worked differently, or was, able to produce more ATP at once or whatever. And that's kind of true for all rep ranges. But like you said, Brian, when you're doing more and more and more and more and more reps, there's a cost that comes from that. Using anaerobic glycolysis, or just anaerobic system, and I know I'm using big fancy words, that produces what we describe as metabolic stress. And metabolic stress creates the conditions in our muscle, which we actually get that feedback that we feel. So if you do a 20 rep set to failure on squats, you will feel your adductors, you will feel your quads, you will feel your lower back, you will feel your glutes, and most importantly, you'll feel your soul. And like, you feel it all. And I do think that is one of the potentially useful tools that are missed from these overly constraining, supposedly science-based guidance. Like on back training, I really like high rep work for people who are not great at feeling the muscles that they think they're feeling. Because when you do a set of 25 to failure on a cable row, you're going to have a pretty good idea of whether or not your lats were actually pretty engaged. And when I started doing things like that and changing my grip position and doing all of these skillful artist style adjustments to my style, like Jeff was talking about, I figured out what way I needed to perform, which is hard to describe even on a podcast. Rows, pull downs, and various pullovers, the joint angle, like how much I bend my elbow, to actually feel the muscle that I want getting that fatigue sensation. And I actually wouldn't know that if I just did a set of 8. And that's how I like to train my back. I've always kind of been like the power builder. So that's been one of those ways that I can get feedback and check, is expanding my rep range. And it's such a common thing that you see people, the most common things I see is glute involvement in certain compound movements, hamstring involvement in certain compound movements versus lumbar or glutes, and then the back generally. Those are often where I'm like, let's play with some things here. Let's do an actual superset. I want you to do something after this and see how much fatigue is left there. I want you to go to failure. And then all of a sudden, the stuff that doesn't matter, like the mind muscle connection, you go, oh shit, my lats really are not the limiting factor or this segment of my back, because there's so much going on in your back, and our ability to perceive that without reaching a certain level of fatigue, and then maybe why we don't experience DOMs and the stories we tell about, oh, this muscle group has, it's more fast switch or slow switch dominant, and that's why you don't get DOMs. It's like maybe you just didn't actually train it that hard.
Like my personal experience, like back training again as an example, because I was loading, like going too heavy. Like the A to B was off because of that. So I'm using leg drive, I'm using glute drive to help move the weight. So yeah, I'm not quote unquote feeling my back while doing it as much. But for me, just slowing reps, like dropping load, but also slowing down the rep speed, I think that can really help out as far as connecting, like getting more of that mind muscle connection. But still, my intention isn't like, okay, I'm slowing this purposely down so I can feel it, in a sense, but to learn it, yes. I think slowing rep speed down to learn movement
Yeah,
patterns
that's a
so you
good.
can engage the correct muscle, like that's important. But then after that, like once you get good at something, then it's almost like you don't have to think about it anymore. And that's the goal for me anyways. Like I don't want to think about training. Like I don't want to have to go through like 10 cues in my head every time I go to do a row. Like I just want it to be like I'm brushing my teeth at this point. So I'm not spending mental energy on that. I want to basically take that load from A to B as clean as possible to the appropriate proximity of failure. And if I'm doing it the way I just described, the byproduct is I'm going to end up feeling it. I'm not proactively trying to make that like the highest priority to feel it per se.
And depending on rep range, you might still feel it less, though. I think if you're
For me, like lower rep ranges, typically I don't quote unquote feel as much. You get higher rep range, you get more blood in there. You're gonna get more of a pump in general. You're gonna feel it more.
Yep. I like that though. Like it's a useful concept, especially when learning. But beyond that, it's has much less utility. I think is something to seek out.
Yeah.
Eric, rep speed. We talked about this before we came
did.
on. So we had a coaches meeting, and you always give us the education on the research and all that, which I highly appreciate. So remember our very first training session we ever did together. This was at the gym by you. I went
You
up there
told
to
me
do
I
an
was being a
article on you.
Porsche.
Yeah, so I was like, okay, you're this guy's training like a race car, man. Everything's like fast, it's ballistic. And then I was almost opposite, like a diesel truck, slow. And I remember you specifically asking me, Jeff, why are you slowing down your concentrics? And I said, I want to feel it more. I want to make sure my form is really good. And you're like, well, and you correct me if I'm wrong. You told me like, well, you're not going to get as much force production out of that. You're going to basically limit the amount of muscle fiber you're recruiting by doing that. And I was like, okay, that makes sense, because if you're trying to, let's say, throw an object, in order for that object to go super far, you got to throw it really fast and hard. Like you're not going to purposely slow down your throwing motion, because otherwise it's not going to travel that far. It made sense. So I started coaching people that way the whole way through. Like we got to be very deliberate with the concentric, put out a lot of output under control, of course, don't hurt yourself. And then this last meeting, coaches meeting, you basically told me like rep speed kind of doesn't matter as long as you're going to the appropriate proximity to failure. And I'm like, well, God damn it. I've been right for 15 years. And now he's telling me 15 years later. So tell us why rep
I'm here for
speed,
it.
whether it's a little fast or it's a little slow, it kind of doesn't matter as long as you're hitting the appropriate proximity to failure.
Well, I'll also tell you clearly shouldn't listen to me, because I'm just going to tell you 8 years from now that I was wrong again and flip-flop. Science is always flip-flop, and you can't trust them scientists. The funny thing is I think I was just probably too focused on the force production side of it and almost kind of conflating strength and force and power adaptations with hypertrophy. And there also are some constraints to it. I think you can begin to slow down so much, like some of the super slow stuff, to where it actually is inefficient. Because essentially what you're doing is you're creating a set that lasts so long that failure is occurring probably for non-muscular reasons. They're perceptual, they're fatigue. The load is just so light. Like there's not a huge difference between doing 50 reps and doing, 10 reps and each one lasts 5 seconds. right? If you're doing explosive, individual reps. And that's not a perfect comparison, but the research we have now, when we look at tempo, indicates that, so long as the individual repetitions don't last longer than, like, say, 8 seconds, and you train to failure, big, important caveat, you get to the same place as far as hypertrophy in a relatively robust amount of data. Um, the reason why is that we don't actually care about force production. Force production tells us something. It tells us about motor unit recruitment. Motor units are just all of the muscle fibers that are recruited by an individual, part of your neuromuscular system, which is called a motor unit. And if you are purposely slowing down a rep, and like if we only did that first rep and I did it explosively and you did it slow, Jeff, maybe I'd be right. But the problem was that then we kept going and I got increasingly wrong as we both kept doing these reps. Because when you are slowing down a rep, let's say you're doing 3-second concentric, 3-second eccentric, 6-second reps, that's slow. If you watch someone do that and you're like, wow, that's a really slow rep. There's going to be a certain point, maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 reps in, where it's going slow on the concentric, but now they're actually not trying to slow it down anymore. They're just trying to retain that 3-second speed, right? And they're eventually going to get to a point where that 3-second concentric becomes a 4-second concentric, and then they're eventually going to get to a point where they can't even complete the concentric. And
you're
what's
technically
actually
kind of pushing harder.
you are
Like
literally
you're
pushing
trying
harder.
to push harder. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. When what has happened is that through fatigue, kind of going back to what I said of why can't you do 1 rep max twice, you're only using probably say 40% of your 1 rep max, right? If you're doing 10 reps, 6-second speed on each one or something like that. You're definitely not using your 10 rep max, right? So that 40% of 1RM, you could bang out 30 reps with if you just had an unrestricted, concentric tempo. But because you're slowing it down, eventually you're going to get to the point where you're near failure with 40% of 1RM and you're barely able to meet the force demands. And your motor units are purposely turning off some fibers, turning on others. This is called either motor unit substitution or motor unit cycling. And eventually they're just kind of like, I've played all my cards and I don't have any muscle fibers left that can meet these force demands. Everyone is fatigued and you can feel it. If you do 10 reps with 6-second total rep speed per rep, it's going to feel the same way as if you did 40 or 50 reps at the end. And you're getting to the same place. Ultimately, if we can kind of just skip through, okay, what happened in the first half of this set? If your concentric eventually gets involuntarily slow rather than voluntarily slow, you've achieved the same outcome. And that's what I didn't understand years ago. Or I was just being too limited and thinking about, well, we're going to do 10 reps. And if I get stronger, I'm getting bigger, yada, yada, yada.
I felt it, but I didn't know why. I couldn't explain to you at the time, like,
He could sense you
why
were full
this
of
works.
shit.
I just knew it was like, this shit's hard.
Yep.
And I'm pretty jacked, so it must be doing something. So
Yep.
it's like, yep. That's
The one
about
thing
it.
I will say, though, is if you're going to train relatively far from failure, then this kind of like doesn't apply. Like
It's
if
not a
someone,
good tool, no.
yeah, because you're not actually going to involuntarily slow down, right? So like if you did 5 reps with your 10 rep max, with explosive intent, that would probably be more effective than stopping 5 reps from failure with a slow concentric speed because
Yeah.
it's so far from failure when you actually think
Right.
about the length of that set.
What's good about this, like I use this a lot in my programming because, people with like aches and pains, older folks like myself, like this can go a long ways towards actually making some gains or maintaining gains because you can utilize lighter loads.
Yes.
Like this is the reason why I'm probably still jacked at this age because I cannot press heavy anymore. Like quote unquote, like traditional heavy for me. Like now heavy for me is like 60-pound dumbbells. Or in the past it would have been like 90s, hundreds. But yet I still have the same size as I did like when I was doing that.
Yep. And I think people get caught up in the numbers too. They're like, oh, hold on, like, but Jeff is lifting lighter weights than he used to. I'm like, well, I bet you if you gave Jeff the 80s and you made him use the tempo he did in, he's using now in his 30s, he would actually not be able to get that many more reps. The strength is similar, like, because your strength is always within the confines of the movement specifics. right? So if you
Sure.
told me, what is your 10 rep max with this tempo, that's going to be a specific number, right?
100%. It's its own
Yeah.
baseline, like we
Yeah,
talked about earlier as far as baselines.
yep.
And from this
100%.
baseline, I try to progress. I'm trying to, okay, let's see if I can get one more rep, or let me see if I can maybe add 2.5 pounds or 5 pounds to it without discomfort. Do you do something similar like that, Brian?
Yeah, I think,
We're over
d- d-
40, so you are listening to this conversation, right?
I am.
Okay. Okay.
I utilize slow tempos a good bit, especially like for arm work. If my elbows feel banged up or something, I tend to go kind of the slower concentric and um yeah, but like Eric, I think a lot of people were taught that early on because we know like maximizing intent to accelerate will increase motor unit recruitment. For example, like a plyometric, like an explosive plyometric, like you will get very high degrees of motor unit recruitment, but you're so far from failure, like, and it's such a small stimulus on those higher threshold fibers that it doesn't do anything for hypertrophy. So I think that that's one way to think about it. But yeah, I think you end up in a very, very similar position. And, like you said, baseline, I think of, a different tempo, it's a different task. So it's like, are the tasks the same? Are the criteria the same? If they're not the same, they can't be compared. And, I was talking to Berto about this the other day. We trained together, and granted, I think I am actually weaker on this movement, but we did a pendulum squat. And like, I mean, I'm no elite power lifter, but like I've squatted in the 500s. Like I felt like I should be using more on this pendulum squat than I was, and I was using like 2 plates on each side. And I'm like, dude, this is discouraging. It's discouraging because I'm weak as shit on this movement right now. And I think the power lifter in me was sort of not comparing similar tasks. Granted, I think there has been some strength loss there, but I don't think there's been significant like atrophy or anything like that. I think it's just I'm comparing that task to a task that's just entirely different.
It's not a
And I
fair
think if I would have
comparison. Yeah.
if I stick with the pendulum squat for more than like, on a consistent basis, it's like I go into that gym for leg day maybe like once every 4 weeks and pick a fight with that machine, I'm going to lose every time, So it always feels discouraging when it's that infrequent. So, I think it goes back to like the whole topic of progressive overload. It has to be built on the same task or foundation. Otherwise, you can't really assess. It doesn't provide you any actionable information when you're comparing numbers on different tempos, different machines. Um, if you had a pause at the bottom, like all of that is just different adjustments to a movement that can radically change the loading or the tonnage or whatever. Um, so really, I think hard sets in practice really is kind of the best proxy we have for an effective stimulus when it comes to just going into the gym and getting a good stimulus. Like if you were going in and like right now, for example, I'm like right in between blocks. I'm kind of freestyling some sessions here for a bit because normally train at home. I've been going to the gym the past few sessions, just change of pace. But I know I'm not going to consistently be at this gym like every time I train upper body. Like yesterday, I trained upper. But there's some machines there that like I wanted to try. Our gym owner gets new machines like every week, it seems like. But the I think by understanding those principles, it's like, okay, I can go kind of freestyle a workout and know I'm still taking steps forward without feeling like I need to compare it to a logbook to tell me that I am. So as long as you're doing enough volume and you're proficient in the movement pattern, I think you can. I mean, most people do this. I'd say the majority of people aren't logging their training. They go in and them and their gym bro decide what they're gonna, you want to do hack squats, you want to do leg press, you want to do this new leg press, pendulum, whatever. But they're still getting a great stimulus and they're still progressing. Now, could it be optimized a little bit? Yeah, probably. Um, especially if there's any degree of like learning component to a new movement pattern. But most people, and Eric, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this. Like how much of an argument do you think that, well, let me back up. So if the argument against variety, like changing things on an ongoing basis, is largely you need to gain adequate proficiency before you can overload or in reality, like get high degrees of motor unit recruitment. I think that's very much the case early on in a training career. And I think to some degree later on in a training career, but most machines, like any pull down machine I get into, like there's not much learning curve there. I feel like I could rotate them out every session and probably still be moving the needle. Free weight movements, that's different. Like if I were to put a bar on my back after not back squatting for 3 months, like that's different. But most machine work, especially there seems to be this renaissance of machine work of late, the past 5 years or so. I think that's not a moot point, but less of a factor for sure.
Yeah, I agree. I think like something can be true, but then someone can provide like overly restrictive and therefore you should never change your exercises, right? Like it is absolutely fundamentally true that if you are still learning a movement, you're probably, even if you feel the sensation of going to failure, like if you do your quote unquote 5 rep max on bench press and it's the first time you've benched, you're probably going to add 25 pounds if you're like a middleweight person that literally the next time you bench press on your 5 rep max. So like it wasn't your 5 rep max last time. You just didn't know how to bench, right? So that can be true, but then you can also apply that context to someone who has been benching for 20 years, haven't benched in 3 weeks, and they get on bench, and probably by their third warm-up set, they're good to go, And that's bench, which is a relatively complex movement. And we got research on this, like the classic study that I used to prove this point, or at least provide indirect evidence for it, is by Chillebeck. And they had untrained women over 12 weeks, and they took a midpoint analysis, and they were doing bench, leg press, and bicep curls. And only their biceps grew at the midpoint, but they were getting stronger on everything throughout. So the leg press and the bench press are, multi-joint movements that, like, even though a leg press is a fixed plane, just kind of, like, I actually think it's hard to know what actual failure feels like on a leg press. Like it just feels hard. And then you go back and look at your video and you're like, I probably could have done 3 more if I really went to the point where I let it slow down and fail and fall on me. So like a movement can feel like, oh, that was really, really hard. And how often as a trainer was someone like, oh, they did 15 reps at a 3 RIR and like, that was heavy. And I'm like, that felt heavy for what you're used to, like you lift groceries, but 15 reps at a 3 RIR is objectively not heavy. But again, I was a competitive powerlifter. I was training, someone who has been lifting for 6 months who was never lifted weights before. So that's just a really important context. And there's a really cool study by Rausch and colleagues on autoregulated exercise selection. And they basically gave one group specific exercise on specific days and the other group, and these are pretty well-trained lifters, free reign to just choose what they want on any given day. And if anything, the outcome slightly leaned in favor of autoregulated exercise selection because they did exactly what you talked about earlier, Brian. They gave these people autonomy and they could choose the movements that they were probably more comfortable pushing to failure, that didn't cause pain, that they had a better quote unquote mind-muscle connection with, and that they liked, So I think it's true, but what does that mean? And if you've been training for a year and you're constantly changing things out in maybe a haphazard way, or you think you have to because of muscle confusion, that's probably not ideal, but you probably want to have cyclical phases of getting exposure to different movements. And also maybe you should get exposure to movements which have a lot of transfer to other movements. So there's also a cool study by Rossi and colleagues where they showed it didn't matter whether you did only squats, half squats and leg press, or only leg press. The improvement in leg press 1RM, even in the group that didn't leg press, they just did squats, was the same. But the squat 1RM improvement was proportional to how much squats they did. Leg press only, worst improvement. Half leg press, half squats, pretty good improvement. Only squats, good improvement. And then if you looked at who got better at their jump height, their counter movement jump, it was the more squats you did, the better you were at it, because the squat transfers to a leg press and a jump. Very similar movement pattern, but it has much higher balance demands. And if you figure out how to balance a barbell on your back, sit all the way down and stand up and go to failure and lift the heaviest you can probably do the same thing with nothing on your back and jump high. And you can probably lay down on a fixed machine path and figure out the balance demands, aka none, on a leg press and push yourself hard. So that's kind of one of those things where it's like it's true, but people are misapplying it. And I think kind of like you guys did a great job on your fatigue podcast where you're talking about like, yeah, yes, some things create more fatigue. Fatigue is almost never the bottleneck. Like you have to be doing some pretty wild stuff with the typical amounts that people train and the most you can get out of it to where like, oh, because you decided to do 13 reps instead of 7, that's what's preventing you from growing. Not a thing, Or yeah, that set that you took to a 0 RIR instead of 1, that's why you haven't grown at all. Not a thing. Or that, oh, the eccentric was too dominant in that exercise. Like, come on. Like, these are not things that are the constraint. So I think we miss that a lot. Like, what is the actual constraint? What is holding us back? And is someone really switching things up so much that they are like a jack of all trades and master of none and not even actually that good at any? Or most bodybuilders I know, they get to the point where they're pretty damn good at all the movements in their gym. And they can, if like, oh shit, like that hurts my elbow, I can do this. And that's a really good thing. And I think from the outside, when you get too rigid in this mindset, you feel like, oh, I have to do these same movements. And I think that if anything, just holds you back because I don't know if it's just the neuroticism that we have as bodybuilders, like we don't want to change things.
I think, like for me as a coach, like I'll see people's personalities because some people like me, they like consistency. Like you break up my routine, I get stressed. My wife says this all the time. If you're out of your routine, yeah, you get stressed. Other people like things like they just need change. They like things to be different and new. So if you're having a personality like just they want things to be changing all the time, teach them how to move in all these different exercises because 1, they're going to enjoy it more. 2, they're going to get really proficient at it, and that's going to lead to more progress. Or vice versa. Like if you're trying to give someone like myself 10 different exercises for chest, I'm going to be like, dude, just give me 2. I'm good.
Yeah.
You're overloading my brain right now. I don't need to think about 10 different things right now. I just need to learn 2. Let me master it. And I'm comfortable here. This is where I'm going to thrive. So a lot of this comes down to individual context too. So and the only way you know that is like by actually communicating with an athlete.
Crazy idea. You mean I can't just throw TikTok reels at my athletes?
Yeah, let's not give a top 5 tier list for exercises based on XX and XXY or whatever. It's like,
I think another argument against too much variation, other than just the proficiency thing, like let's say somebody is proficient in these movements. If you're past like the novice, early intermediate stage, like you really want to look to performance as like your diagnostic tool to assess
100%.
progress. And if you're changing too frequently, sometimes you don't know if you're actually improving.
That's where logbooking is important because people like, I guess the latest trend is bashing the logbook. I'm like,
yeah,
that keeps the focus and intention where it really should be.
Exactly. I forgot what I was going to say, but yeah,
sorry.
I just wanted to mention that. That's right.
But no, it's a good point. Like if you are changing things so frequently that you are unable to tell if your performance is improving, that is in and of itself its own check and balance. So I can't tell you, dear listener, what is too frequent of changing things up to be able to tell if you're improving. But if you don't log, you can't tell. So like, for example, I do go through phases sometimes where a certain movement I only do every 3 to 4 weeks. But I look back at what did I do last time. And sometimes I do this intentionally. Like, you know what? Actually, I've been running deadlifts. I don't know if you guys have seen my stories lately, but I kind of just got a hair up my butt because I'm similar to Jeff. Like I like my routine and then I like to just execute. And then sometimes I get the sense of, am I present? Am I focused? Am I being intentional with this? Let me change something just that forces me to have that psychological intent again. I don't do with everything. It's like 1 or 2 things. But anyway, I've been running RDLs, and I was getting really, really strong on them. And they were also starting to get a little mentally intimidating to where I didn't feel like I had the right headspace to bring myself to try a PR. And I was like, let me see what I can do with conventional deadlifts. Because if I can do like 180 for like a set of 6 to 8, man, I'm trying to think, what was my best RDL when I was pulling my PR of like 222 or like 490? And it was way less than that. So I've ran for the last 3 weeks just working up to a top triple on deadlifts and then doing a back down set on RDLs. And I hit lifetime PRs. Like I just did 220 for a triple, and 220 was 2.5 less than my 1 rep max back in the day. So this week I'm going to attempt to hit 500 pounds for a triple, something I've only done sumo. So kind of going like, all right, what did all that RDLing do for me, right? Or another one is like, okay, what did all that leg pressing or feet forward Smith machine do for me on this other movement that involves my quads or something like that? And I think if things are working and you are reasonably experienced and you have one of these pretty heavily ingrained motor patterns, you should surprise yourself. And one way that I have been very confident in my progress is that I've come back to these movements that I haven't fully lost proficiency on, but that I'm not actively super attuned to. So I know I'm at like 95% efficiency on it. And at 95% efficiency, I'm hitting a PR. I haven't done this in 3 months.
Yeah.
That's a good sign, in my mind.
That's what I was going to say. I was going to mention, I think early in your off season, I don't know if it was when you tweaked your hamstring. I don't think it was then, but you had taken a break from RDLs for a bit, and then you came back to it exactly what you just said, and you had a PR performance for the off season. Like in that situation, it's hard to hedge your bets against hypertrophy being the driving factor there. I think that's about as encouraging as it can be there.
Yeah. So I think there's, there is just a lot to this. I think if the listener is kind of like, oh man, like I can give you those principles again, like I can tell you, you ideally you want a muscle that is being trained at a long muscle length, but you want it to target the muscle. You want, as Brian said, task failure and muscle failure to be pretty overlapping if you're using that exercise for a specific muscle rather than like general growth of a given region. And yeah, like those are great. You want a good resistance profile, but you also want to have plate. But then what you do with that information in a program needs to be highly individualized and needs to be like, you need to be able to have the tactical ability to be flexible in the moment, like auto regulate when you go into the gym. Like if you can't do a movement first, is that okay? And what are you going to do? You need to have that agency and autonomy. And to do that, you need to have like a baseline understanding of these concepts. And I think most people's understanding right now when they're following like science-based content, I think it's removing options rather than adding them.
Mm-hmm.
They're becoming
That's a
more
great way to put it.
restrictive.
That's a great way to put it.
We got to this really awesome place where like, shit, man, like almost every rep range works if you go to failure. Oh shit, almost every tempo works if you go to failure. All right, like if you're going reasonably close to failure, but not all the way, unless it's like really high reps and you can gauge it, great. And now you're getting these messages that are overly restrictive, like don't do drop sets, eccentrics do nothing, don't do this rep range. You need to be in this specific RIR, not over, not under, because fatigue is a boogeyman and it's going to get you. I don't care if you're hitting PRs because fatigue's still there somehow. I don't know. And you look up and it's like, I can do 5 things. And if I can't do these 5 things, I don't know what to do. And you start to realize that you haven't actually learned knowledge. You've become a dogmatic zealot and you have less options. And that's really not the goal. So hopefully this is helping push back against some of that.
I like that.
Science, skill, art. When you have that's a nice blend. If you're going to become far more well-rounded, if you use all those to your advantage.
What about art, science, and skill, Jeff? And then we make an acronym out of it. What do you think?
Art, science, skill. What is that? Ask. Yeah, okay. That sounds good to me. Ask questions. That's how you learn.
It spells
Be inquisitive.
Ass. It spells ass, Jeff.
Does it? Oh, I'm sorry.
Maybe we have
This podcast,
art.
it's this. There's too many reps right now, and the reps are taking far too long. So yeah, my brain's not working.
Maybe we go like art, science, knowledge, and then we got to ask.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Ask. Okay.
There is one, I think we've covered a lot here. There is one thing that I wanted to touch on related to biomechanics. And it's the idea, of biasing certain muscle groups within a compound. So like take a back squat, and elevating your heel. And that can be a great tool, especially if people lack ankle mobility. But I'll even take it a step further. Let's say like on a leg press, putting your foot higher or lower. Higher up, going to tend to bias glutes a bit more. Lower, going to tend to bias your quads a bit more. But that doesn't mean that having your feet higher doesn't train your quads pretty hard. And so I think when people look at bias, they almost look at it in terms of like in an absolute sense.
Isolation, like you're isolating it.
Yeah. So I think like low bar squats, this is a good example where the moment arm at the knee is typically going to be smaller with a low bar squat for most people. But most people are also, not all, but most people are going to be stronger with the low bar squat. And so when we look at biasing, really what we're trying to do is increase the torque demand at a joint. And so a low bar squat trained, close enough to failure is in many cases the torque demand could be similar as if you do like a heels elevated high bar squat potentially. And so the challenge at the quads is similar. The relative challenge might be more evenly, might be lower though. So it's the difference between like absolute and relative. Can you explain that any better, Eric? Because I feel like that's a little verbose.
No, I think you did a good job. I think I can add a different explanation that might complement it though. So when you perform say a high bar squat versus a low bar squat, you're going to notice that when you get to failure in both, you start to perform the movement differently. And this tells you about what was the primary contributor and what's fatiguing first, right? So the low bar squat typically just gets more and more and more super low bar-y and good morning-y, and then it just stops, right? But it's still pretty similar. But when you do a high bar squat, you start to see this hips shift back and then back under the bar pattern. And then eventually you see kind of the bend in the upper back. And that is because you're getting a greater relative contribution of your quads in the heel elevated high bar squat position until you get to a point where the force demands can no longer be met with the quads being the dominant energy producer, at least in certain ranges of motion, or I say force producer. So you're going, shit, if I want to get through this midpoint stick, I need to get some glutes and lumbar and hamstring out real quick. So zoop, and then back under, right? So that's where I think it is useful to use slightly more constrained movements that are still compound movements if you want to, quote unquote, bias a given muscle group. And that's where you see people get the wedge out and get under the Smith machine and shift their feet forward, because you can only shift your weight back so much. Or they go low stance foot position on a leg press because you can't change your hip angle. So the degree to which that is a useful strategy depends upon the individual, right? But I think it's also still important to understand, like, if you put your feet all the way down at the bottom of a leg press and you bring your knees into your chest, think about how deep of hip flexion you're actually in. Your glutes are absolutely contributing a tremendous amount. But because the demand is so high on your quads, the limiting piece, the weakest link in the chain, is going to be your quads, ultimately. They're going to give so much that you won't be able to overcome the force demands of the movement of a low stance, let your heels float off leg press with your glutes, because the quad, you still have to extend your knee. Like, you figure out how to do a leg press without extending your knee, then you've done something magic with physics, right? So your glutes can't do it alone. So they need your quads. So the glutes can give a max contraction, everything can be going, you can grind your face, but if your quads can't meet the force demands when you change the movement pattern, they become the limiting factor. But your glutes still got trained to whatever degree they did, right? So I think that's important, because some people, like Jeff said, will see it like as an isolation exercise. Like, oh, a low stance leg press might as well be a leg extension. Like, absolutely not. Like, if you did an 8 rep max, that's a set for your glutes. It should be counted to some degree. Did they reach the 0 RIR that your quads did? No, maybe they were at a 3 RIR. I don't know. That's going to differ between individuals, limb lengths, and the relative strengths between muscle groups. But it's absolutely something. And it's not the same for everybody, which I think is where people get caught up a little bit. But you're kind of thinking about it being like a sliding scale. Like, all right, I have someone who tends to get great glute development from compound, simultaneous knee and hip extension movements. I would like to see them grow more quads. Let me start trying to shift those sliding scales more towards the quad, because I think everyone starts in a different position with where their sliding scale is based upon mostly their limb lengths, height, biomechanics, and joint range of motion and training history. So you're going to kind of get these perpetuated, I'm not going to call them muscle imbalances because that sounds clinical, but I'd say physique weak points if you kind of maintain that same exclusively multi-joint, exclusively free weight approach to training. And that might be the best way to go if you wanted them to squat the most weight possible. But I do think there's probably a case to be made to where, you know what, if we could get a little more quad meat on this power lifter, if they're doing something that looks quite unorthodox from a powerlifting training perspective, maybe their net force production at 1RM would be slightly higher and they could squat more, even though they're always going to be a glute dominant kind of good morning-y squat pattern, perhaps.
I think too that where I see a lot of the utility of that is like if you can make something more load limiting too, especially like axial loading, if you can make it just easier to less taxing, like if I want to use the word systemically, then I think that has a lot of utility too. Like if I can, like if I do a heels elevated Smith machine squat with my feet in front a bit, even if it's just a couple inches, I mean, it's like my loads are almost like cut in half, like it is significant. Like I can
And then
put
you slow
two
the
plate.
recipe down a little bit too. And there you go.
Yeah. So you can work around a lot of those, if your back's bothering you, that might be a good alternative, something with less shear on the spine that's, allowing you to do that. And I do think like a low bar squat, if some people will let their hips kick back because their glutes are just stronger and they're seeking the path of least resistance, But if somebody's deliberately trying to kind of hold their quads to the fire and get every bit of force production to drive the bar vertically with their quads that they can, and then they start to compensate by kicking their hips back, like those are two different scenarios. And in that scenario, I can't confidently say this, but maybe like in terms of like an overall lower body mass builder, there may be advantages of a low bar versus a high bar if you're getting some glute at the end of the low bar. That's like you're getting those last couple reps, you're taking glutes a little bit closer to failure. I mean, it's a different task because the movement changed, but you're getting slow contraction velocity in both muscle groups.
I think the front squat is one of the greatest demonstrations of this because it is a self-limiting movement. You get to the point where your quads can't meet the force demands, you shift back on your glutes and you dump the bar. You know the point where your quads are no longer able to meet those force demands because it's the point where you go bloop and hopefully you got bumpers on,
But could it be your upper bodies or your lower back just can't support that bar anymore? Like your quads have the gas, but your upper body is like, I can't hold this.
Certainly can be. Yeah.
Then you're limiting your quads.
Yes. It's like if we're talking about like an Olympic weightlifter who's got that massive, great flexibility in upper rack position, then yes.
Okay.
But for sure, whatever is the limiting factor is a really important individual. It's like to your point, the front squat will tell you that in an Olympic lifter, but it might not. And like, hey, I'm going to try a cycle, and I can only do the hands over the like the bodybuilder thing, or I need to grab straps, because I don't have that upper back strength for sure.
That person needs to go on a hack squat machine.
Yeah, like I can't remember the last time I programmed front squats for a bodybuilder, to be honest, unless they had equipment restrictions.
Same.
It's a badass exercise to be strong at, though.
Absolutely. Like shout out Mike T.
Mike T, the 600-pound front squat. Like holy shit.
Yeah,
that's crazy.
I remember just getting into the high 300s. It feels like that there's so much just trying to maintain position for a lanky dude like me too. I'm just like, geez, that's impressive. So massive front squatters are as a rule badasses. So shout out Mike T.
Shout out Mike T.
I think we've done it, right?
I think so. I think you
Believe
guys
so.
brought up, like, it's funny. Sometimes we can overwhelm people with scientific principles and all this knowledge and go, how do I apply that? But I think we almost overwhelm people with context, which is not a bad thing, because they realize, oh, I had these black and white notions of how things should be, but there's a lot of, it's like the English language. There's almost more exceptions to the grammar than there are grammar rules, right? So I need to think of these as tools rather than rules. And I think that is not only a good lesson, but that rhymes, which makes it even better. So
I think we've gotten them to maybe think about like how things should be for me. That's all I
I
gotta
love it.
say.
Well, I want to say thank you to you both. Thank you, dear listeners. And hopefully this has expanded your understanding of how to apply some of these biomechanical principles in a practical lens and not to be as limited or constrained by some of the content you come across, even when it is accurate content about the biomechanics of lifting. And I will see you next time in the 3D Muscle Journey podcast.